Welcome to Delighting in the Trinity with Michael Reeves, brought to you by Union. This podcast brings you teaching and preaching from our archives, and you can find more resources, audio, video and books at unionpublishing.org.
Okay, and so we move from England to Egypt. And we move to another very smiley character, who's not smiling here. But this is Athanasius. His name means the immortal. And he's rightly named. What a character. He's unforgettable. He was a slightly more naughty personality than Sibbs. He had a real twinkle in his eye. He loved jokes. And he had one of the most penetrating minds in all of history. His insights, and I hope you'll feel it in the next few minutes, are like a rapier going through you. They're just extraordinary. He just sees with clarity. Now, he was born in North Egypt around the year 300, just before the year 300. And just before he was 20, the biggest crisis that would define his life came up. In the year 318, an elder of the church in Alexandria in North Egypt, who was a man called Arius. Now, you would have thought it would have been given away. Arius had no reflection, which, of course, you would maybe think, should you trust him as an elder in your church? But he began teaching, saying, and he was very effective at doing it, he said, the Son is not the eternal Son of God. He came into being at some point. He's not truly eternal God. He's a creature. A very exalted creature, but just a creature. And Arius was very good at selling this viewpoint. Now, again, you'd think, now, why would anyone buy this from a guy like this? But what he did is he set up choirs to sing his theology in the streets of Alexandria. And, in fact, this became a bit of a nuisance. So his choirs that started singing things like, there once was a time when the sun was not, doo-da, doo-da. There once was a time when the sun was not, doo-da, doo-da, day. And it was catchy jingles, and people were singing this in the streets. And, in fact, it spread around the Mediterranean. It spread to Constantinople. And there, those who believed the sun is an eternal being said, right, let's have our own choirs. And so you start having rival choirs out singing each other in the streets. He also set up a magazine called The Watchtower. No, not really. But his legacy lives on. Well, anyway, his theology became very popular. And Athanasius was going to be caused great, great trouble by this. Now, Athanasius was originally affirmed, as Athanasius responded to Arius, Athanasius' position was originally affirmed by the emperor Constantine. But Constantine soon died, and his son became the emperor. And the new emperor would do all he could to hunt down Athanasius. The emperor agreed with Arius and did not like Athanasius, who he thought was a troublemaker. And so what he did is he would send imperial search parties to go get him. And so there was one time, for instance, when Athanasius was holding a church meeting, and the emperor ordered 5,000 troops to surround the church. And suddenly, from all sides, they just burst in, swords drawn, arrows flying into the congregation. But it's just revealing, Athanasius was so loved that his monks around him simply grabbed him and bundled him out the side. So he tried to get everyone else out first so they wouldn't get hurt. But his friends grabbed him. By the way, he was quite a small little guy, so they literally could just shove him under their cloaks and wheel him out. But just to give you something of his character, he really was quite a character. There was another time he was on the run from the emperor. And the imperial stormtroopers were after him, and they were chasing him up the Nile. So he was heading up the Nile to get away from the imperial troops. And this imperial troop ship was just behind him, of course going faster than his little ship could go. So what he did, he said, turn the ship round. And everyone's, what are you doing, Athanasius? So he turned the ship round and drew alongside the imperial ship. And the troops shouted across, have you seen Athanasius? And Athanasius himself replied, yes, he's not far off. And then he drifted back downstream and slipped into Alexandria. That's the kind of guy he was. He was a funny guy. Well, Arius taught the Son is not really God. Now, so far you go, okay, I'm not hugely persuaded by Arius. I'm not really with him. Here's the interesting thing. Arius taught that the Son is not truly God, but he did it by going through a thought process you go through every day. So he's a slippery character. And here is the thought process. Quite simply, he tried to define God without the Son. Here's how he did it. He's saying, okay, how should we think of God? How should we define God? God is the origin, the cause of everything else that exists, right? But he himself is not caused to exist by anything else. Yeah? God causes everything else to exist. He's the origin of everything else, but he's not himself. He doesn't have an origin from anyone or anything, right? That sounds quite reasonable, doesn't it? You're going, what's wrong with that? Everything's wrong with that. Because if that's your definition of God, if God is the one who has no origin in anything else, what do you do with a Son who has his being from the Father eternally? And so because he defined God as being without any origin or cause, he therefore said, so the Son cannot be truly God. The Son doesn't fit into my definition of God. So the Son is not truly God. Does that make sense? Do you want me to unpack that a bit more? Yeah? So he's defined God in a purely philosophical way. He's saying, who is God essentially? God is the one who causes everything else to exist, who is the origin of everything else, but has no origin himself. That is God. But the Son, being Son, must have his origin, receive his being from his Father, which he does eternally according to the Bible. So, but Arius is saying, no. If the Son has any origin, if he receives his being, he cannot be God. So you have a definition of God now which snips out the Son. Make sense? So, that different starting point, that basic understanding of God, God is the unoriginate, he would say, the uncaused. That basic understanding of God is going to mean that the gospel Arius preached simply felt and tasted very different to the gospel Athanasius would preach. Just think, who would Arius pray to? How would he start his prayers? Oh, unoriginate. Do you think unoriginate's going to listen? It's not exactly a very warm prayer, is it? Oh, unoriginate. But trying to think of God without the Son in this purely philosophical way, that's the God Arius was left with. And so let's try to think, okay, what sort of God has Arius been left with? If the Son is a created being, what is God like before the Son exists? Right? So let's say the Son comes into being at some point, year 3. What's God like before year 3? So what's God like when he has no eternal Son? Well, one thing we can be sure of is he's all alone, right? This God's all alone by himself, the unoriginate. So he's solitary for eternity. Solitary for eternity, he can have had nobody and nothing to love. So therefore, love is not his heartbeat. For eternity, he's not loved. There's nobody he could have loved, or it could have loved. And he might love himself, but we usually call that selfish. It's not being loving. And so this lonely, unoriginate Arius has come up with is fundamentally a self-centered being, not a God who is eternally loving. He could not be eternally loving, which means this God Arius has come up with is essentially all about private self-gratification. Never loved anyone or anything for all eternity. That just isn't part of his wiring. And so you've got to ask, why would he ever create anything? Well, why do you think he might create? Imagine that you were God, all alone for eternity. Why might you create? Because you're lonely and want some friends? Because you like being pampered, want some servants? Those sort of reasons, right? So either you're lonely or you want service. And that was the problem with Arius' God. That this God, not being eternally loving, it didn't make sense that he would ever create. Because if he spent all eternity by himself, well, and that clearly must be what he likes. He can spend an eternity just by himself, in solitary confinement. Then wouldn't the existence of a universe just be an irritating distraction to him? He's very, very happy just looking in the mirror. Why would I want to think about anything else? And so creating just looks like a deeply unnatural thing for such a God to do. Why would he do it? Probably so that he could use what he created for his own self-gratification. So this God wants to think about himself. His creation, you, are just an irritating distraction for him. Now, do you ever wonder that when you pray? Seriously, do you ever think, when you're trying to pray, do you think, seriously, does God up there care about little me down here? Am I not just an irritating distraction to him when I pray? Is it like that actually God is up in heaven thinking, what now, earthling? You know? If you ever think anything like that, you're thinking of Arius' God, not Athanasius' God. But you see, if God's not eternally Father, as Athanasius will come on to see, was arguing, if Arius was right, that God eternally does not have a son, so he's not eternally a father, then this God could never give us the right to be his children. He's not eternally fatherly. If unoriginate did not enjoy eternal fellowship with his son, you wonder, well, has he got any fellowship he could share with us? Does he know what fellowship is? If, for example, if the Son was a creature and had not been eternally in the bosom of the Father, knowing him, being loved by him, what sort of relationship with the Father could the Son share with us? You know, if the Son had never really known the Father, but is just a mere creature, how could he bring us close to the Father if he's never known him himself? If the Son is not eternally in the bosom of the Father, he can't bring us to be with the Father. Now, with Arius' God, everything looks very different and dark. And with Arius' God, without having the eternal Son, salvation looks very different as well. This unoriginate, well, he might allow us to live under his rule and protection, but at an infinite distance, approached perhaps through intermediaries. Now, he might possibly offer forgiveness, but he simply could not offer closeness, could he? Yeah? If he's been all on his own for eternity, you are a mere creature. You cannot be brought to be his child right before him. You will remain always, well, you were created to be a slave. You might be saved if you're saved to be a slave. That's all you get. And since by definition he's not eternally loving, would he deal with the price of sin himself and offer forgiveness for free? Most unlikely. And so distant hirelings we would remain, never to hear those golden words Jesus says to the Father. John 17:23, Father, you have loved them even as you have loved me. Are those not extraordinary words? Brush your teeth with those words every morning. Father, you have loved them even as you have loved me. Arius God simply could not compute that. And if God were like that and always been alone, why would he speak? He's gone for an eternity without speaking. Why would he bother starting now? The habit of keeping himself to himself clearly runs very deep, eternally deep. So such a God would be far more likely to remain unknown. And so Arius believed that there could be no true revelation of God. Because if Jesus is not truly God, if Jesus is not the exact representation of his Father's being, if he's just an exalted creature, then if it's just a heavenly servant created at some point, then all that Jesus can reveal is just a pale imitation of what God is like. It would be a pure lie for him to say, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I am the exact representation, the true image of my Father. If he's not eternal God, of the very being of his Father, that's a lie. He does not reveal his Father. And so if Arius was right, that God does not have an eternal Son, then God cannot truly reveal himself. He doesn't have much of a salvation to offer, if any. And what would the Christian life be like if Arius is right? What's Arius' Christian life? Well, quite apart from questions like, would this God be gracious? One thing we do know is this God is self-obsessed, right? He spent all eternity just with his own company and is clearly happy with that. And by the way, that's something that was thought to be good, that he's eternally introspective. He spent an eternity looking into a mirror thinking, me. And Aristotle's God was exactly like this. Well, in fact, Arius is taking his understanding of God from Aristotle. Aristotle believed that God in his majesty is just so majestic that all he would want to think about is himself. That actually everything else is just not worth thinking about since he's got himself to think about. Yeah? Does that make sense? So he's going, why would I ever want to think about you when I'm so attractive? Yeah? I've got myself to think about. I just don't actually want to think about you. So for Aristotle believed that's a good thing. To be completely self-absorbed. Not thinking about anything else, anyone else. That's what God's like, according to Aristotle. And so Arius. Now, if that's the case, if that's how God is, what is it to be God-like? You too should be very introspective and selfish. That is being God-like. Just think about yourself the whole time. Probably thinking, how am I doing? How am I doing? How am I doing? And whether that's a focus on my own performance, my own brilliance, my own heart. Arius, God leaves me to be self-obsessed. But trying to think about God without the Son, what happens is, just as I talk about this God, do you find he's just not that interesting? That was the problem with Arius God. Solitary for eternity, not loving. You start, if you think about God as Arius did without the Son, you start imagining God to be cold and distant. And what happens is you start finding you are just a whole lot more interesting than God. Because he's not very interesting. Because you've gone the wrong way in thinking about God. Well, that was Arius. Ignoring the way, the truth, and the life, he defined God without the Son. And the fallout was just catastrophic. For without the Son, God was not truly an eternal Father. He must have become a father at some point. He's not really, eternally a father. Eternally alone, he's not truly love. Thus he can have no fellowship to share with us, no Son to bring us close, no Spirit through whom we might know him. And so Arius was left with a very thin gruel of Christianity. He was left with a life of self-dependent effort under the all-seeing eye of a distant and loveless God. Depressed? Enter Athanasius on his great white charger to save us. Athanasius simply boggled at Arius' presumption. Athanasius thought, how can you possibly know what God is like other than as he has revealed himself? You can't just make up a definition of God like that. But the consequences you're seeing are terrible. No, he said. Now get this. This was his... Come on. This is a key. This is his maxim. He said, it is more pious, more accurate to signify, that is to get to know God from the Son, and so call him Father. That's the way to do it. Instead of naming God from his works only and calling him unoriginate. Now let me just unpack that for you, because it's a very dense observation, but a very profound one. He's saying the way to go in thinking about God is you go to the Son. The Son is the revelation of God. And the fact that he's a son means he's the son of... Yeah? So he must have a father. So he reveals a God who is Father. Father. Eternally, essentially. You don't try to get your basic understanding of God simply from the things that God does. For example, creating. That's not the basic definition of God. So if you say the basic definition of God is that he causes other things to exist, you'll call God unoriginate. The one who has no origin but gives origin to everything else. Does that make sense? Go through the Son and you'll know the Father. Go through any other way and you'll end up with a wrong basic definition of God. Right? So the right way to think about God is to start with Jesus Christ, not some abstract definition we've made up, like uncaused or unoriginate. And in fact, you shouldn't even set out, he said, in your understanding of God by thinking of God as creator. Now, why not? Very interesting point. Let's say we do. Let's try to think it through together. What would be the problem if you say God is essentially, the most basic definition of God is he is creator? What's wrong with that? You know? Sorry? He was created himself. Go on. Absolutely right. Yeah. I think your answer is very, very profound. Well done. That if you're saying he is, the most basic definition of God is he is the creator, then he needs his creation to be who he is. Right? If the most basic definition of God is he is the one who creates, then he needs his creation. So there must be something about God that's more essential than being creator. What's God like before he creates? Yeah? And that was the problem. So you can't say, okay, I'll say God is the creator. That's my most basic definition of God. No. There's something more fundamental to be said. And our definition of God is to be built on the Son who reveals him. And when you do that, starting with the Son, you find there is something more fundamental to be said about God than the fact that he's creator, the fact that he rules the world. The first thing to say about God is, as it says in the Creed, we believe in one God, the Father, eternally. That's who he eternally is. So Jesus says of himself, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Being a son means he has a father. And the God he reveals is, first and foremost, Father. And that is the God revealed through the Son, the eternal Son. That he's not, first and foremost, creator or ruler. Before all that, he's Father. And that different starting point and basic definition of God would mean that the gospel Athanasius preached felt different. Arius would pray, O unoriginate. Athanasius could pray, Our Father. How different. Just that captures so much. Now, I have to say, not everyone instinctively warms to the idea of God as a father. Some people's experience of their own fathers, of overbearing, indifferent, abusive fathers, makes their guts squirm at the thought of God being a father. But here's the thing. If that's you, my heart goes out to you. And those of us who are fathers know that none of us are perfect at all. But God is not called Father because he copies earthly fathers. The Father is not some pumped up version of your dad. So if you had a bad, cold, abusive father, don't read that onto the Father. To do that is quite simply a misstep. I understand why you do that, because the same words are in use. But it's a misstep. It's rather that earthly fathers are supposed to reflect the Father, but while some do that well, others do a better job of reflecting the devil. So what does it mean that God is a father? Well, first and foremost, it does actually mean something. You see, my dog is called Max. That tells you absolutely nothing about Max. You have no idea what sort of dog he is, what he's like, whether he likes ripping at people's throats or wagging his tail. You have no idea, and I'm not going to tell you. But, no, he's friendly. But if I can make the jump, and it's a big jump, the Father is called Father because he is a father. It's not a name that doesn't reveal something about him. He is a father, and a father is a person who gives life, who begets children. And that insight is like a stick of dynamite in all your thoughts about God. For if before all things, before he ever created, God was eternally a father, then this God is an inherently outgoing, life-giving God. It wasn't that he gave life for the first time when he decided to create. Before he ever created, he was life-giving, eternally giving life, being, and love to his eternal Son. Now, this gets unpacked for us in 1 John 4. Just flick with me to 1 John 4. What does it mean that God is Father? (1 John 4, verse 7). Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. And get this, anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. Wow. That's a very strong statement, isn't it? Well, think of it this way. Have you ever known someone so magnetically kind and gracious, someone so warm and generous of spirit, a really mature, Christ-like Christian, who is just so kind that in their presence you become kind, even if only for a short while when you're with them? Do you know they're just so lovely, you cannot be nasty about other people when you're with them. Yeah? You know, I hope you know someone like that. I know people like that. And I think they are little pictures of how God is according to John. He's saying God is love in such a profound and potent way, you simply cannot know him without yourself being transformed to become loving. Whoever does not love simply does not know him. And that's precisely what it means for God to be Father. For when John writes God is love at the end of verse 8, he's clearly referring to the Father. See verse 9, he goes straight on. In this the love of God was made manifest among us, that God, who is love, sent his only Son into the world. He's talking about the Father, right? The God who is love is the Father who sends the Son. And so to be Father means to love, to give out life, to beget the Son. And so before anything else, for all eternity, this God, Athanasius God, was loving, giving life to, delighting in the Son. And so seeing this, Athanasius loved to compare the Father to a fountain. A fountain. Now, the reason he's doing it is he's saying a fountain, to be a fountain, must pour forth water, right? If it's not pouring forth water, it's not a fountain, right? Just so, the Father, to be Father, must give out life. Otherwise, he's not a Father. So it's not like this God has love as like one of his many moods. Rather, he is love. If he did not love, he would not be Father. John 17:24, Jesus says something remarkable. If you've ever wondered the question, what was God doing before he created the world? You ever asked that question? What was God doing before he created the world? Some theologians like to answer with the question, what was God doing before he created the world? He was inventing hell for those cheeky enough to ask such questions. Actually, to answer the question is very easy. What was God doing before he created the world? John 17:24, Father, you loved me before the foundation of the world. That's what this God was doing. Before he ever created, before he ever ruled the world, before anything else, this God was a Father loving his Son as he poured out his Spirit on him. And that changes everything when you understand that God is like this. And I've got a little opportunity here to show you how Christians agree across centuries and across countries. So I'm just going to show you how some of the other guys we looked at just chime in with all this. So here's something from John Calvin. He understood this very deeply. John Calvin said, we ought, when we think about creation, we ought to contemplate in creation God's fatherly love for us. So, as creator and ruler of everything, you must understand that he creates and rules as a father. For as a foreseeing and diligent father of the family, he shows his wonderful goodness towards us. To conclude once for all, whenever we call God the creator of heaven and earth, let us at the same time bear in mind we are his children. Do you understand? He's saying that since God is before all things a father, before he ever creates, he's a father, all his ways are beautifully fatherly. That's who he is. So it's not that this God does being father as a day job, and he kicks back in the evenings as plain old God. No, he is father. Fatherhood isn't some nice sort of blob on top of him. He's father all the way down. That's who he is, eternally. And so all that he does as Father. He creates as a Father, he rules as a Father, which means the way he rules is very different to the way Arius God would rule. This God rules in a fatherly way. And that's a very profound observation, for it's only when we see that God rules his creation as a kind and loving Father that we'll then actually be moved to delight in his providence. You see, I might acknowledge the rule of some heavenly policeman and say, yes, he has a right to rule, but I don't delight in his rule. But I can take delight in the rule of a loving Father. Well, let me take you to Martin Luther in his later days, clearly. And for him, the fatherhood of God really changed things. Really changed things. That he said that as a monk, when he thought about God and he thought about the righteousness of God, he grew, we saw last night, to hate God because he simply didn't understand what his righteousness is. Why does he hate sin? And he simply failed to see any further into who God is. And so Luther found he could not love this God who's just the judge, who's just the ruler. Just could not love him. And so, who did he love? If he couldn't love God, we all love something. So, of course, Luther and the monks transferred their affections elsewhere to... Do you want to have a guess? Mary. Couldn't love God, so he loved Mary instead. And the saints. Because, well, at least they seemed closer, more accessible. He could actually love them. That changed when he began to see that God is fatherly. And later in life, he began to reflect that in those early days as a monk, he said he had not actually been worshipping the right God. Isn't that strong? As a monk, he'd not been worshipping the right God. For he said, it is not enough to know God as the creator and judge. Only when God is known as the loving Father is he known aright. Now get this, he says, although the whole world has most carefully sought to understand the nature, mind, and activity of God, it has had no success in this whatsoever. But God has revealed and disclosed the deepest profundity of his fatherly heart, his sheer, inexpressible love. So Luther was saying that through sending his Son to bring us back to himself, God has revealed himself to be inexpressibly loving and supremely fatherly. And what Luther found was, not only does that give great assurance and joy, it wins our hearts to him. For he said, we may look into his fatherly heart and sense how boundlessly he loves us. That would warm our hearts, setting them aglow. In this God, we see a God we can really love. This is the God heralded by Athanasius. A fatherly, life-giving, eternally loving God. Do you see? So, look to Jesus. Like Athanasius, start every day with him, and then you'll know God truly as the Father who loves. Very different to Arius God, unoriginate. The God revealed in Jesus is not needy. The God who is creator, of course, is needy. He needs his creation. He's essentially creator. But this God revealed in Jesus is not needy, not solitary, not selfish, but bountiful, effusive, self-giving at the very heart of who he is. And so here is a God we can really want, whose sovereignty we can wholeheartedly rejoice in. But there's just one other thing that was vital for Athanasius. You don't just look to Jesus to know that God is a father, you see, here's the Son, he reveals a God who's a father. You look to Jesus to know God as your Father. You see, through Jesus the Son, we see that the great love of the Father gets aimed at us. And just how great that is. Let's go on in 1 John 4 if you're still there. (1 John 4). In this is love, not that we've loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. You see, through the sending of the Son for our salvation, we see more clearly than ever just how extraordinarily generous and self-giving the love of this God is. We see how serious his love is. Let me turn to open this up as a question then. So, in the sending of the Son, we see the love of God. But let's ask it this way. Why did God the Father send his Son for us? Why? Any Bible verses spring to mind? To bring us to God? Yeah. Yep. John 3:16, God so loved the world that he sent his only Son. Absolutely. Romans 5:8, which is? Yeah. So he's demonstrating his love in sending his Son to the world. There's actually an even more primal reason why. Why does he even love the world in the first place? Because we're his creation. Why does he create them?
John 3:17.
Yeah.
That the world would be saved through him.
Mm-hmm. Why would he want to save the world, though? Come to John 17. I've been teasing you long enough. John 17. They're all true, everything you said, but there's something extraordinary to be seen in John 17. And John 17 is an extraordinary prayer where we hear the Son speaking to the Father and about us. Because he's praying, John 17 verse 20, Jesus is praying for those who will believe in me through the word of his disciples. But let's go from verse 24. Jesus says, Father, I desire that they also whom you've given me may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you've given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. Righteous Father, even though the world does not know you, I know you, and these know you've sent me. Get this. I have made known to them your name, and I will continue to make it known, that the love with which you have loved me may be in them. Whoa. That the love with which you have loved me may be in them. John 1:18 describes God the Son as being eternally in the bosom or lap of the Father. Now, we would never dare imagine it, but Jesus is saying that his desire is that believers might be with him there. That indeed is why the Father sent him, that we who've rejected him might be brought back, and brought back not merely as creatures, but brought back as children to enjoy the abounding love the Son has always known. And so the Son unites himself to us by his Spirit, that we might freely share what is his. The Son has always enjoyed the Father's love, and the Father sends the Son that we might share in that enjoyment of the Father's love, that he might be the firstborn of many brothers. The Father's love for the Son, as it were, bursts out to be spread, to be enjoyed. And so Jesus, united to his bride, his people, he brings them before his Father, one with himself. And so he can say to the Father, John 17:23, Father, you have loved them even as you've loved me. And so as the Son brings me before the Father with their Spirit in me, the Spirit that anointed the Son, as the Father pours out the Spirit on his Son, that Spirit flows down to me. And so with their Spirit in me, I can boldly cry, Abba. The Spirit of Jesus, the Spirit of sonship, moves me to cry, Abba. For their fellowship I now freely share. The Most High is my Father. The eternal Son, my great brother. And the Spirit, no longer just his comforter, but mine. Look to Jesus, else you'll forget that God is a loving, eternally loving Father. Look to Jesus, else you'll forget that he is your loving Father. This was the shape of the gospel flowing out from Athanasius' understanding of God. Going to the Son, he found a very different sort of God to the one Arius found. When Arius ignored the way, the truth, and life, the God he ended up with had a very stripped down salvation. There's no closeness with the Father to enjoy. He can never cry Abba, never know security. And so, my friends, for the refreshing of the church today, let us be a people who speak much of Jesus, who open his word to proclaim him, because, as Luther put it, through the Son, we may look into God's fatherly heart and sense how eternally, boundlessly he loves us. That would warm our hearts. Is this not an attractive God revealed in the Son? Is this not a heart-winning God? Let's pray. Oh, our Father, our Father, that we can call you that, and it means something. Oh, our Father, your humble, loving Son is the radiance of your glory, the exact representation of your being. From Zion, perfect in beauty, he shines forth. And so through him, we see the splendor of your generosity, your kindness. We see that you are so good. Blessed, blessed be your name, our Abba. Amen.
You've been listening to Delighting in the Trinity with Michael Reeves, brought to you by Union. Union is devoted to growing leaders and growing churches. Our School of Theology equips leaders for ministry. Union Publishing supplies them and their churches with quality theological resources and books. Union Mission supports and financially helps church planting and revitalisation. And Newton House, Oxford, invests in the next generation of theologians and scholars. Our vision is to see leaders and their churches the world over reformed and renewed in the gospel of Jesus Christ. To find out about our courses and learning communities around the world, to buy Union books, to discover support for your church plant, or to become a friend of Union and support our ministry, visit www.theola.gy.